Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Dorr. I'm ISA's Director of Professional Development. So today we are here with a virtual discussion from the Diplomatic Studies section. And Andrew Cooper is going to be talking about his book, The Concentration Impulse in World Politics.
Concertation.
Concertation. Oh, concertation. Oh my goodness. Let's do that again. Today we're here with Andrew Cooper and he's talking about the concertation impulse in world politics. So just a few pointers for today's discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat. You can write it in the Q&A, and you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you. So there are a few options, and I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to get started.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And from me, good afternoon. I'm in Copenhagen, so it's the afternoon here. My name is Christine Eggeling. I'm the co-chair of the Diplomatic Studies section at the ISA, and very happy to be the chair or the moderator for our virtual panel here today. We have the pleasure of having a book presentation from Andrew Cooper on his new book called The Concertation Impulse in World Politics. And I too am very curious about this concept and what you mean with it. Andrew Cooper is the university research chair at the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And we'll hear from Professor Cooper for about 20 minutes presenting his new book. Thereafter, we will have a discussion of the book by three really great panelists joining us from all kinds of corners of the world today, which I think is a really nice sign that the section is alive and kicking and internationally very spread out. So we will hear, and I think we will just go in the order of the participants on my list, from Professor Jeffrey Weissman from the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University in Chicago. And then we will hear from Professor Emel Paladar from Marmara University in Istanbul. And then last but not least from Professor Jeremy Cornu at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And we have 20 minutes approximately for you, Andrew, and then we will hand over to your three discussants, which will talk for about 8 to 10 minutes each. Let's see how it goes. If you go wildly over time, I will politely, or let us say diplomatically, interrupt you. And then, as Sarah said, to anybody in the audience, you're welcome to already, while the presentation is going on and the discussion is going on, to post any questions you might have in the chat, and we will collect them later on. But enough from me, and I turn over to you, Andrew.
Great, Kristen. Thanks for ISA. Thanks also to Asaf, who can't be here, but kind of facilitated a lot just to kind of show the face and say that it's a great pleasure to present this book. It's a big book, at least for me. The OUP has been very indulgent. 150,000 words, 372 pages. Obviously, I'm indebted to a lot of people, certainly on screen and beyond. So I'll see if I can just get onto the... So that's the cover of the book. I have to say, very pleased with it. It's a concept that I've been playing around with for a long time, but it's also a change in my focus. If people know my work, and certainly you can see on the screen, it was probably identification over the last 10, maybe longer than that, is to sort of try to expand the ambit of diplomacy, sometime mainstream, certainly within the Oxford Handbook of Modern Diplomacy, with many colleagues. You know, this is sort of just trying to push sort of orthodox diplomacy, but then in a lot of different ways. And of course, even collaborating with Jeremy, with Emil, with Jeff on other projects and beyond. There's a lot of kind of probing, kind of unorthodox. So everything from celebrity diplomats, former leaders, niche diplomacy way back when, going to Antigua and looking at Antiguan diplomacy vis-a-vis the WTO and the United States. So this book is very different. This book is looking much more at conventional, sort of regressive diplomacy. And again, you can see what the image of traditional concert-based statecraft looks like. All these different images of the past, right? Concert of Europe, the leaders in 1919, the leaders in 1943, 1945, and the one that usually escapes attention, but certainly post-colonial scholars have brought it back, the Berlin Conference, 84, 85, you know, certainly the scramble of Europe and so on. So this is sort of the background of the book. The central argument of the book is that, at least in mainstream international relations, there's been a kind of a misconstruct of the fundamental institutions of the world. If you look at the US-centric, institutionalist, rationalist IR, there's two types of institutions that are given primacy. And I think this is right through the ambit of the rationalist institutionalists, right from the neo-institutionalists, rational design, even into neo-realism and liberal internationalism. And that's the primacy of multilateralism and the primacy of sovereignty. And this book, I think, challenges this. I'm frustrated by the notion that these really are the only institutions that are important, and therefore that this is the only thing that we should be sort of talking about in terms of practices of diplomacy. Lots of problems, I think, with this binary, even in sort of definitional terms, whether you can kind of talk about multilateralism being an institution rather than a process, and certainly sovereignty as an institution rather than some sort of artifact or constitutional component of domestic life. But in any case, I think we need a different sort of conversation about the processes of diplomacy, the practices of diplomacy, and really where diplomacy is cited. And here I go back, and certainly Jeff and others know this literature extremely well. Go back to Hedley Bull and the English school as sort of the inspiration and to some extent the corrective guide, the basic guide for the book. And again, you can see that at least in countries like Australia, Hedley Bull is well sort of acknowledged, the Hedley Bull building at ANU, but also sort of around the world among the aficionados, the English school scholars, that even if they're perhaps less numerous, are certainly extremely fervent and active. But I think this gives a different twist to the English school, and certainly to Bull's writing. I've gone back to, I think, an article that hasn't got much attention by the constructivist scholars, Wendt and Duval, who had an article defining or recognizing the differences between what they term the new institutionalists, Cohen and others, with the old institutionalist. And in some ways, they point out the fact that it's much wider in terms of the English school, and particularly with the continuum of institutions that Bull focuses on, with war, and I guess you could kind of have spheres of influence on one side, and the concerts on the other side, much more palpable institutional component. And certainly this is the aspect that I'm focusing on: concerts, a process of dialogue, a process of joint proposals, and directed, at least notionally, to some form of global management in terms of the operation of policy making. And again, you can see that this is in some ways borrowed from domestic politics, from a lot of work, certainly in the 1970s and 80s, about domestic policy, concertation, and sort of corporatism at the domestic level. This isn't to say that Bull actually uses the word concertation. You've got to be kind of agile as an academic. And indeed, the academic that does use concertation comes from a different tradition, Robert Cox, again, using that sort of link between domestic and international politics. But Bull moves around. He talks about concerts, he talks about condominiums, and particularly talks about concerting with. And here we open it up, and he's usually talking about concerting with in the context of the third world / global south. And what Bull sees as a fundamental institution is predictability, institutions that are reproduced over time, that they're not just ephemeral, they're not just linked to a particular sort of time or epoch or era. And there his criticism of the focus on multilateralism, particularly through formal international organizations. He sees that this is a very compressed and narrow form of global activity. The other aspect that's important is that he sees kind of two models of concertation, and this is picked up by other English school scholars, Andy Harrell particularly. Sort of pluralist on one hand, where you have coexistence among unlike states, and solidaritist, where you have kind of a commonality of interests and perhaps even identity with countries. So the pattern of my book is, and this is the original purpose, was somewhat more limited. It was just sort of to trace Bull and see how you link his thinking on concerts into the processes of the institutions that I'm certainly interested in, but also I think that fit the two models, one on the G7 and the G20, and the other sort of much more global, South-oriented, the BRICS. And again, I think this opens up a real kind of layers between sort of conceptual thinking and operational concerns. So animated by these frustrations, animated by my original purpose, I guess there's a duality of my approach. Bull is the guide, Bull is the kind of animator, Bull is the kind of glue of my work, and in some ways, of course, the rationalist, institutionalist, or the foil of the book. And I think particularly with the lack of attention at all on these other sort of competing institutions, where there's a huge neglect. I mean, sometimes explicitly, Cohen is more critical of the consultation pattern in the past. Snyder and rational design really sort of ignore this type of approach, at least for a long time. And this is the other puzzle, because we can see that even though they start off with this kind of binary about sovereignty and multilateralism, particularly through formal organizations, there's also a great deal of shifting around without explanation about why they're shifting around. Cohen goes through all sorts of different periods of his academic life, and it's certainly a very rich life and a very impressive life. But he moves from regimes, which basically are informal. He goes and studies WTO and UN, that's formal. He goes back to looking at kind of society plurilateralism, looking at public-private relations, which again is informal. And Snyder and Abbott and a lot of other colleagues are even more kind of moving back and forth without, again, explanation. Snyder and Abbott write this very important article in 1998 saying that formal organizations are superior, dominant, really there's no room for informality. And then by 2012, 2013, there's a whole array of scholarship, of publications that really have an informal turn to them. So again, the only consistency is really non-consistency. They don't tap into the work by Wendt and Duval. They don't tap into the realists that focus on concertation, whether it's Older, it's the Kissingers or Holste, or even somebody like Daniel Dresner. What they like is John Mersheimer. He's their perfect realist who really doesn't deal with institutions. So there's no real debate about institutions. Beyond, though, my original purpose, there's kind of, as I got into the rationalist institutional literature, I became even more frustrated with the gaps in that literature. There seem to be a lot of unevenness, a lot of problems with looking at this literature that really aren't given attention. One, and there's three of them that I won't give any attention to because of time, but we can do this in question and answer. Three, one is sort of they don't have any privileging of crises. There's a huge amount of inconsistency about what the focal point of institutions should be, whether they should be efficient or whether they should be normatively driven. And there's really no concern about individuals. The only individuals, if you look through indexes of the rationalist, institutionalist, usually they're historical figures. You know, they're in the 19th century, it's FDR, maybe Margaret Thatcher makes an appearance, but no other institutional kind of personalities. And I think this is a sort of a big defect. I mean, you don't have to be a historian to realize that there is an animation with personal agency. But there's two components of their work that I think really play into the more diplomatic component and the practice of diplomacy that really jump out as huge gaps and huge deficiencies in this type of work. One, of course, is the centrality of the United States, that somehow the United States is this consistent manager of the system. There's a sense of socialization from the United States, and certainly a sense of commitment to the process, to the multilateral process, kind of defending against self-help sovereignty. And when you look at this, it just doesn't seem to make sense. You're looking at the institutional initiatives of the United States and looking at works like Cohen's own colleague, Putnam, you know, about the G7. There certainly seems to be a process of the United States being a serial concertor. You know, the G7s, or even formulating the G20, George Bush, and the Snidel and the rational design, even more problematic in some ways, because they see the design of the system as completely flat, that every country has equal rights, equal obligations, equal power within the system. And again, I just don't think this sort of stands up when there's this animation by the United States in particular institutions. So again, this isn't just sort of looking back and being historical about the US choices. What also, and indeed I devote a whole chapter to this, is the neglect or the inability of the rational design scholars to predict anything around the line of the Trump phenomenon, the rise of Trump. And this in itself is, of course, hugely important for domestic politics, but even for institutional politics, the idea of Trump preferring some institutions over the other. And again, when you look through Trump, it's quite clear he's not a solidarity concert oriented politician personality. Again, his whole array of issues at the G7, very uncomfortable. As uncomfortable in the G7 as he is in the UN. But the G20, very comfortable. He likes sitting around with the kind of pluralist leaders. Again, the peer approval from, so you can see, I mean, even though the picture I've got on the right isn't of the whole group, it's certainly a very different picture than the picture on the left, the classic sort of G7 picture of Trump. The other aspect, and of course this gets into a whole different component, is not just the neglect of the global South, a complete disinterest, a lack of any sort of curiosity of the global South. The only two things that matter to this huge literature is whether there's a sense of socialization of those countries, as well as middle powers, as well as Western European powers, as well as Japan and South Korea, or whether the countries in the global South are going to be disruptors in the system. And I think this really moves the global South into a very kind of stereotypical image, where there's a lot more sophistication, there's a lot more subtlety, there's a lot more historical concerns that need to be factored in. And again, just quickly, the cartoon I always like, because it's brought back during the G7 in Cornwall, is an older cartoon from China that colleagues of mine say were in all the school books in China in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And this, of course, is the unequal treaties, a very different form of concertation, right? Concertation without China. We see the US, every country has an animal attached to it. Of course, in the G7, even Canada with the beaver and so on. So certainly this is a very different image. And of course, this opens up that the Global South has always had some options that have concertation impulses of their own, right? And I was very lucky in November to go to Indonesia on a speaking tour and go to the Bandung Museum. And again, you get the power of authority and normative and potential of that type of Global South solidarity concert that again is completely missing. I mean, Amitav Acharya and others have done a good job, but very different. So again, moving in and sort of finishing up, we can see that Bull's model in some ways does sort of equate with at least two sort of institutional forums that are really interesting and are given short shrift by rationalist design scholars. One is the integration of Global South countries into this pluralistic model in the G20. I don't think anybody in the 1970s, 80s, 90s would have imagined that there would be a G20 where you would have Indonesia chairing, president, hosting a G20, and then passing it over to India, and then passing it over to Brazil, and then passing it over to South Africa without warfare, without a major challenge to the regime. This strikes me as something that's hugely important institutionally, and yet receives no time, no effort, no curiosity about this, kind of dismissed as some sort of showpiece and performance art and so on. And secondly, of course, and I've learned to talk about them as BRICS plus, but we can see through Bull's lens that concerting together, that concerting with and beyond the West has also moved well beyond the model of the Bandung Conference in 1955. Again, whatever you think of the BRICS in terms of substantial interplay, certainly just the image of countries from the Global South, and of course with Russia, and of course with China, and of course adding new members in last year into the mix. Again, important, whether you are normatively approved of them or not. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so on. So again, I'm not arguing that Bull got everything right. I mean, this book in some ways had a very personal connection to me because Bull gave his last lecture at the University of Waterloo a long time ago. And it's a fascinating lecture because even though there's still all sorts of neglects in his work, it's almost like he's had some sort of transformation in the last years of his life, that he goes back and sort of brings in the Global South as an important construct and justice as an important construct in international relations. But also, and again, it's a big sort of part of the book, is that he accepts that there's going to be rules and a need for order, a need for the system to have some discipline in it, but he worries about the arbitrary nature of that system. And again, looking through the order since 1945, I don't think we can ever overlook and overestimate how much arbitrariness there has been in the system. So once more, lots of technical concerns and defects in Bull, certainly in terms of he gives little space to the room for societal actors, even in the BRICS and the G20. He doesn't really have much of an IPE notion, and certainly much of the concertation in the 21st century are going to be driven by finance and by economics. And finally, I don't think you can see that his sort of exaggerated view of formal organizations really formal organizations need to be downgraded, but not to the point, as Bull talks about, pseudo institutions. I think that probably this is, again, quite excessive. But at the same time, the flaws of the mainstream literature needs to be given. And certainly there never seems to be any apologies or any reconsiderations and any recalculations, never kind of mea culpas that somehow they've got it wrong. And when you look at the type of work, you see that they've got it wrong in all sorts of different ways that I hope other graduate students, postdocs, younger academics, and so on pick up. But if there's a negative, there's also a positive, that in some ways now diplomacy, I think it's the time for diplomacy to come back. We can do archival work, we can do interviews and so on, but there's a room, and again, Jeremy and I have worked on this as well. They're kind of on the front lines, whether it's in the front lines, going to events, going to forums, or kind of just being out in the front lines, dealing with kind of society craft as well as statecraft. And I think this gives huge advantages. And at the same time, I don't think we can leave the mainstream off the hook. I think when you look through, it's quite astounding how little criticism this sort of mainstream literature has attracted. Occasional people flurry into it, but there is being a kind of a disciplinarian component to this, that I think people have been worried about careers, about their own, moving up the pecking order in terms of the international relations career. And I think that should sort of end. I think there's lots of opportunities now to kind of get into this sort of mix and say how other components and other frameworks, particularly through the ISA, and of course, particularly with a centrality of diplomacy. So I'll leave that. All I'll end with, of course, is that it's great to have an OUP book. It's great to have the privileges of having 150,000 words. But of course, this comes literally at a cost, right? This is not the cheapest book. So again, I put up, certainly in terms of the Google, the scholar ability to at least get a few chapters in terms of this. And certainly, I hope your libraries are generous in terms of opening up those to the accessibility. But this has been wonderful for me. I'll see many of you, if not all, at ISA, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We'll do a virtual round of applause. Thank you for your great presentation. And I think we will straight on give the word to Jeffrey Weissman, who is your first discussant. And as I said, we have about 8 to 10 minutes for comments from the three of you. Please, Jeff.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and thanks so much, Andy. A couple of years ago at an ISA Distinguished Scholar panel for Andy, I noted his uncanny ability to see trends in their very early stages before they become fashionable. And here I was thinking of his work on middle power, niche diplomacy, international commissions, celebrity diplomacy, diplomatic afterlives. Now, this book is different. I think it shows in really a career-spanning and a very wide-ranging fashion that he is an inveterate conceptualizer in the field of IR, and I would say world politics in general. Now, I have 5 observations, Kristen, that I'd like to make, and then 2 questions to finish for Andy. First, I think this book is an incredible work of synthesis. And the bibliography is testament to that. And I think his book highlights just how much has been written over a very long period of time on concerts and on this new word or unusual word, concertation, by so many scholars. And I think he synthesized all of this work with attitude. His thesis is creative, I think, and I think it is bound to generate much debate, and I think response to many of the scholars that he criticizes. Now, to have these 2 concepts, concerts and concertation, put under Andy's microscope in such a forensic fashion was really quite an eye-opener for me, and I think it will be for other people as well. Now, my second observation is that the book's anchoring in Hedley Bull's work on concerts is persuasive. Andy fills the book with plenty of caveats, and I think all of this is appropriate, but I don't think his anchoring of his book on Hedley Bull is overcooked. Now, related to that, and Andy mentioned this, the story of Bull's evolution how he shifted or how he calibrated the balance between order and justice in the last years of his life, in his move in the early 1980s from pluralism toward solidarism, I think appropriately was made at the University of Waterloo. And I think, Andy, given your affiliation, I think this seems especially fitting. And I like this epistemic network, if you like, coming to the fore. My third observation is based on Andy's what he described today, and it's very clear in the book, his deep sense of personal frustration. What I would say is his epistemic beef, if you like, with how mainstream institutions they are, especially the work of Cohen, but its rational design variant, Abbott, Snydall, Korominos, have all interpreted this contest, as he describes it, I think nicely pugilistically between formal and informal institutions. Now, the institutional scholars, as he argues, really do ignore the institutional ramifications of the concert format as a viable fundamental institution. And in the process, they really do overstate, in Andy's view, sovereignty is self-help, dynamic, but also multilateralism's importance and utility. Now, for Andy, in contrast, and he stressed this in his remarks, the central contest in the 21st century, the now, today, is between formal international organizations and informal consultation. And this is evident, he describes many times, in terms of a state-based, small cluster, plurilateral summitry. I hope I'm quoting you right there, Andy. Now, in all of this, he aligns with Bull and in the Anarchical Society, but in his later work as well. Now, I actually think that Bull and Watson, Adam Watson, former British diplomat, underestimated the UN at the time. And I still think, Andy, that it's a site for the making of world politics, to pick up on the language of Sending and his colleagues. Now, if you take one small example from the last year or two, if you think back to the invasion of Ukraine, remember at the time of the invasion, February 2022, the chair of the Security Council was none other than the permanent representative of Russia. Now, this was quite an extraordinary coincidence, if you like, but nonetheless, true, there was no council resolution condemning Russia about the invasion, but there was, for me, a lot of consequential diplomacy going on at the same time. And I think the same could be said about Gaza at the moment. True, no Security Council resolution, but a lot of diplomacy around the edges. Now, my fourth observation, a little longer, is that is about how the book really clarifies and contests several important concepts and distinctions. And I just want to mention 3 or 4 of these. The very first one, as I've already mentioned, is this distinction between informal and formal institutions. And basically what Andy is saying is that the informal is much more than a mere category in world politics. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. Now, one qualification I would offer is that he possibly underplays the role of informality within institutions. Now, Andy in the book touches on this at several points, very appropriately, but I tend to give it a bit more prominence in institutional development. For example, how the UN Security Secretary General is appointed. And here I'd note Andy Vincent Puglio's work on the UN Security Council, in which he shows the importance of grey zones in the working of the Council. So I think that's kind of important. So in short here, I think there may be a stark either-or choice between formal and informal, but yes, it is fair to say that there is a contest between them. Another important concept that Andy talks about is that between fundamental and foundational institutions. And I found myself looking for my dictionary here, Andy, in terms of what is the difference between fundamental and foundation. And I struggled a little bit, I have to confess, intuitively. And so I think I prefer Barry Buzan's language of primary and secondary institutions. And so my basic point here is simply, I suppose, almost a pedagogical one. And that is that I'm all for binaries, right? I'm happy with them, but they should be intuitive, hard and soft power, bilateral and multilateral. And I don't think fundamental and foundation is as intuitive as I would like it. Another point that you mentioned, Andy, is on crises, and I won't go into that. You went into that nicely today and in the book. I do think that this is something that has a history, and you add to the firmament very nicely in your book. The difference, another conceptual difference, concerts and consultation. Here, I think, Andy, you do address this question of, is this idea of concert, does it suffer too much from the historical baggage of the 19th century Europe, our concert of Europe idea? And I think you do try and modernize it and bring it up to date. I think it is a bit of a hard sell, as you mentioned, with people like Cornelia Navari. But nonetheless, I think in your arguments and the photos you even showed in your presentation of the big 3 summits in World War II, the US-Soviet Cold War summits, these are examples of informal consultation. We'll just call them something else. And I think that is a good argument. Where I think you almost clinch or make your argument more compelling is when you come into bringing the G20 and the BRICS. And I'm wrapping up, Kristen, very, very soon. And here, I think when you give the example of Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa taking over as chairs of the G20, that resonates with Bandung and all of that symbolism. And I think that's very, very nicely done. So I think that's where your argument becomes very compelling. My 5th and final observation is I think there is, Andy, a lot of normative presentism in the book, not just in your work, but in almost everyone's. This is almost unavoidable. But I do want to just highlight a few of the normative preferences that I see emerging in your book. You have a general sympathy with the non-powerful over the powerful. And I should say, by the way, that I cheerfully agree with almost every one of these preferences. You favour the non-incumbents over the incumbents. You favour the global south over the north. You are harshly critical, excuse me, quite rightly, of Donald Trump. But you say he's not an anomaly. This unpredictability has been there, and Bull highlighted that a long time ago. You seem to favour, Andy, Canadian leaders, such as Paul Martin, over American leaders. You certainly highlight the importance of economics, which Bull absolutely neglected. You prefer agency over structure. And you really do cite approvingly of the critical scholars, such as Robert Cox and others. And you do take issue with Cohen, Eikenberry, and other, let's say, what you call mainstream IR scholars. So, Andy, I think what you're doing here is trying to get us to enlarge the notion of global governance and to do it in an innovative way in where this idea of informal concerts, with all of its historical baggage, plays a bigger role. So my question, two questions you've partly answered very quickly. What does the expansion of the G20 at the South African summit mean for your theory, for your thesis? And the other thing I want to ask is, in the Canadian context, do policymakers take what you're saying in this book, which is very scholarly, do they take it seriously? Or is there a separate kind of debate that the policymakers are having about these kinds of issues? But for a scholarly work, Andy, a wrap up to a superb career. Congratulations. Well done. Kristen.
Good job. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Just in the interest of time, Andrew, I think it's best if we take the discussants' comments first, and then you can reply at some length to the colleagues. Emil, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to this esteemed event, and it's an honor for me to be a part of this distinguished gathering. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Cooper and ISA organizers for giving me the opportunity to share a few words on this momentous occasion. This book not only criticizes institutionalism or rationalist IR, but also complements Hadley Booth's previously written and lesser-known lectures by rereading them and combining them with additional research. It presents new perspectives based on Professor Cooper's past works, collaborative efforts, developed networks, and observations. The aim of the book is to provide a more inclusive understanding of today's changing world order, conceptualized as post-Western or non-American or multipolar global governance and international organization studies. The book provides a comprehensive and multi-perspective view on various topics, including contemporary crisis, the hierarchy of international system, case studies of informal organizations like BRICS, the impact of populism on modern international cooperation, and the comparison between old and new forms of concertation. Its re-evaluation of the concert and concertation concepts brings innovation to the studies of international cooperation and global governance. International cooperation now requires evaluation through multiple theoretical perspectives beyond rationalist IR, considering concepts such as informal governance, IIGOs, symmetries, and ad hoc coalitions within a broader and post-Western framework. In this regard, this book offers a new perspective that encompasses these concepts and arguments. Professor Cooper's new book aims to go beyond the narratives of multiplex international order and presents a perspective that diverges from the notion that international cooperation excludes the global south or the developing world. It seeks to demonstrate that a transformative and evolving international cooperation cannot be understood without considering the diversity and inclusion of these regions and actors. Rationalists, on the other hand, rationalist IR scholars claim that rationalism does not exclude the global south, but rather includes and influences it in the process. This book challenges this idea. I believe that Professor Cooper's new book will shed light on and inspire researchers and scholars working on international cooperation, global governance, IOs, IIGOs, and international order. The book's emphasis on concert and concertation concepts will particularly serve as an example for those working in the field, encouraging deeper exploration of the concertation framework. I think that the book will bring novelties and unique aspects to the literature in the following fields. First, the book seems to offer a comprehensive re-evaluation of the concept of concertation, as I said before, in IR, challenging mainstream institutionalist perspectives. Second, the book delves deeply into the various dimensions of institutional design and behavior, including the motivations behind concertation, its operational test, and its potential as a fundamental institution. Third, the book tries to integrate diverse theoretical perspectives and empirical analysis, drawing on insights from scholars like Hadley-Bull, Eikenberry, Cox, and others. Fourth, the book emphasizes the role of crisis as potential catalyst for institutional change, challenging mainstream IR's reluctance to prioritize crisis as triggers for institutional transformation. Fifth, the book, and I think the most important novelty of this book, is its focus on the perspectives and agency of actors like multiple actors in the global south, particularly like IOGOs like BRICS, MICTA, etc. By examining their motivations, challenges, and contributions to the institutional entrepreneurship, the book sheds light on the evolving dynamics of global governance. In short, I believe that international cooperation is undergoing continuous changes, especially in this new era, characterized by increasing geopolitical rivalries and strategic autonomy. And I anticipate that states will increasingly use informal international cooperation and their mechanisms. This book challenges existing dominant academic theoretical approaches and offers a new and inclusive academic perspective in the light of all these developments. As a speaker at this event, I am humbled by the opportunity to witness the unveiling of such a significant scholarly achievement. Professor Cooper's research not only expands our intellectual horizons, but also prompts us to reconsider our approach to addressing the complex challenges facing our world today. Thank you very much for this invitation, and congratulations again, Professor Cooper, for this great book. I think this book will inspire continued dialogue and inquiry in the pursuit of a more just and harmonious international order. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for these great words. And we'll go over, last but not least, to you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thanks for the organizer, the ISA, for making this panel happen. It's great. It's a new format for me, and I'm glad to see it working well, even in spite of the time zone and the complexity in arranging everything. So my comments will start from maybe the opposite of what Andy said, which is he started by saying that he was a bit out of his realm by looking at concert, which is a very traditional institution. And when I was reading the book, like Geoff said, I was surprised by how synthetic the book was of his own work before, because this is a book that builds on the last 15 years, or at least 10 years, since I was a postdoc at the University of Waterloo. Andy Cooper was already working on the G20 and having a reflection about the global South and the institutions that have different forms than the IO, the formal IOs. So this is something that Geoff mentioned. I think this is the strength of the book. This is a synthesis on a lot of work on various dimensions, the populist challenge, which I worked about with Andy also, the G20, the G7, the global governance. So this is a major book because it provides the foundation, the theoretical foundation for all the previous intervention by Andy. And so it's a strong book. It's a book that is long in the making, and it shows the depths of it. Is very, very fascinating. It's unique book for that reason. So that's something that, like Geoff, I was surprised. I discovered that Concertation was indeed a major institution. I saw continuity where before I didn't see it. I see continuity between the concert of Europe and the G20 and even the populist challenge to the international organization. All this was disconnected before I read the book, and now I see the logic, I see the continuity, and I think this is a major achievement. This is a great door that is now opened, and that I really hope others will cross, looking at the world through this lens, through the conflict between concertation and IOs and formal institutions. So great, surprisingly innovative on a topic that has been well debated already. I also appreciated how he frontally challenges Keohane, Krasner, Snydel on the rationalist institutionalist literature, but I'll say more about it later. Let me say something general about the book, and then I'll mention 5 different points quickly, because I know we are short on time. So first, it's not a book about informality. It's a book about concertation. And sometimes the two are put together. And I remember when I read the first version of the book, the draft, that distinction was not as clear as it is now in my head. Informality happens in many different ways within IOs, at other levels of analysis. As Geoff mentioned, you have informality within IOs, but it's a book about concertation. So concertation, and by this, Andy means the meeting of heads of states to solve ad hoc problems on a very light, institutionally speaking fashion. It's good that in the book, formality is not opposed to informality, but I agree with Geoff, there could be more reflection about how informality sometimes shapes informal procedures. I could see it in my own work on WhatsApp, for instance, how informality is all over the place in formal institutions. And this also tells us how limited the view of rational institutionalist is. But overall, it's a minor point. I think this is about the impulse to concertation. And my first point is looking back at the word impulse. It's unexpected if you think about it. It's an urge. We don't really know where it comes from, But that's my first remark. It connects well with practice theory. In the end, and maybe that's a weakness of the book, Andy put a lot of emphasis on concertation, but much less on impulse. Where does it come from? Where, if it's not rational, because obviously this is not the theory Andy is driven by, but I would say this is the impulse suggests that it's something that we do because this is how things are done. So maybe it's a practice, and that could have been maybe interesting to dig deeper into where this impulse comes from. There is continuity. We observe things, but when we try to understand where it comes from, there is the agents that are putting this together, but what motivates the agents to do what they do remains undiscussed. While I think it's important given how crucial it is, even in the title, the impulse of concertation. And by the way, I'm surprised the editor, the publisher, agrees to that title. And I wonder, that's maybe a side question. I wonder if you had debates about the title, because there are a lot of complex words in this title, which makes it maybe a hard sell. I don't know. My second point, it's a book that fits our time in incredible fashion. Very certainly a crisis of international organization. When I teach global governance, that's what I start by saying. We observe this crisis in its different aspects. The challenge is, what does this mean exactly to us, this crisis of IOs? And these provide some answers. Just let me speak about the Canadian context, because I think it's interesting. If you look at Canadian foreign policy, and it's another part of Andy's work that is not discussed at all in this book, or almost not at all, but it's still a contribution he made in the past. Canada seems at lost because it bet so much on international organization with liberal internationalism and the UN and the fight to sit on the UNSC and the failure to sit on the NSC. It's as if Canada and decision makers in Canada did not understand what Andy Cooper has put the finger on, which is that the world moves away from international organization to concertation, to informal discussion about problems. And in this world where things are changing, Canada is still trying to, well, promote international organization, to promote its national values and interests. So Canada seems at last, and that's also one of Geoff's point. It would be very interesting to see or to know if decision makers in Canada take that into account, because I think there is something very interesting that could guide a Canadian foreign policy that I think we can all agree on is pretty weak, and it seems lost in this world where tensions are rising and tariffs and all sorts of things. Third point, it's interesting to see actors, individuals, human agency, creativity, unique solutions to urgent problems, given a lot of attention in the book. Against a discipline that tends to emphasize structures, continuity, stability. And I think, and most of us agree on the panel, agree on that, that is why it neglected diplomacy for so long. Because if you look at structures rather than agents, then you don't really need diplomacy. You need diplomats, because, and that's something I've been working on for a long time now. It's because you have people doing things that are able to change and solve problems. So it puts the focus on agents, on individuals, rather than the structures. Even if practice theory obviously has a very deep understanding of the impact of structures on agents. That's where I think the second half of the book is very interesting, when concrete examples are discussed. at length, in detail, as Andy Cooper is a well-informed observer of this G20, G7, Trump hectic behavior. This is a very rich, empirically speaking, this richness is illuminating. We see concretely how diplomats and decision makers choose to do what they do and why. It's interesting, they're called institutional entrepreneurs in the book, rather than, for instance, concertational entrepreneur. So, fourth point, it's a well-argued criticism of US-centric IR, and I share the frustration of Andy that is obvious in the book. So thank you, Andy, for doing that tedious work of going back to what was written and showing how inconsistent internally and externally this literature is. But that's also something I was wondering while I was reading the book. Do you give too much attention to QA? His book is discussed at length so much. I had an overdose of QA at the end. Frankly, that's really even more than Bull. Sometimes you go after QA, and it's important. QA is certainly influential, but like all of us, I think he's writing from a place, the US, with a purpose and an agenda in a specific context. His thinking is necessarily limited, and he catches up with current events. In a way, it's paradoxical to give him such a central place because, well, obviously you show how deeply flawed his work is, but in the end, you end up putting him in a prominent space. And that's giving the US IR a very important place. I understand that's your main contribution here, so I understand the choice. But for a non-US scholar like myself, I was really overwhelmed by QA. My last point is going back to practice theory, because sometimes the definitional limit of the concert are hard to find, and you do discuss that in the book itself. You show a continuity between very different contexts across time, and this is the fascinating dimension of the book. But are some form of international concertation, like Trump's, for instance, starting with a similar impulse? So if you look back at impulse rather than concertation, concertation is the form that the result, the observation that we can make. The impulse is the driving force behind this concert. So concerts take many shapes, but is all the form, the concert coming from the similar impulse? That's a question I was wondering. And certainly Trump, you do discuss that in a very nuanced way and very convincing way, how you seem to oscillate between, oh yes, it's concertation, but no, it's not exactly what concertation is. To some extent, I think practice theory could have been illuminating here, because it would have helped you delimit concertation. If you define it as a set of practices, then you would have been able to say, okay, this is concertation, this is not concertation. So it would have been easier to step back, look at the practices associated with concertation, and then exclude abnormal or aberrant behavior. My guess is that if you look at it through these lenses, Trump do not practice concertation, even if sometimes he may look like he did. So that's my 5 points. Overall, extremely important book, I think. Strong, convincing, new, original, innovative. That's really what you can expect from a book by, I think, a major scholar of diplomacy like Andy Cooper. So thank you, Andy, for all these insights. You drove me in my academic journey, and even intellectually, you still continue to feed my reflection. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Andrew, as you can hear, your panel is very enthusiastic about your book. So am I. I've already written down a lot of colleagues' names who I want to send a link to the book to, who I think should be reading your work. So I just want to remind the participants, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to post it in the chat or ask to raise your hand, and then we can also put you on the screen. But while we're waiting for more questions to come in, Andrew, maybe you would like to respond to some of the points and questions that were brought up by the three discussants.
Yeah, 2 or 3. I mean, obviously, it's exciting and exhilarating to have such a response. You know, it takes a little bit of time to digest just that kind of celebratory aspect. But on the substance, I mean, just kind of going back into some of these debates. One was probably I did give more attention than maybe I started out with somebody like Cohen and indeed the whole rational design construct as well. But I think it is because they set themselves up in a kind of a superior status to other. And I think that's why I think they have to be addressed and why they have to be tackled in a very kind of direct way. I mean, Bull doesn't set himself up, you know, as being scientific or being, you know, a kind of, you know, somebody that has a total consistency. But yet, when you look at his work, there's a lot more discipline in his work than you find in the rational institutionalists. Like I said before, they're all over the place, you know, and even when there's frustration on their part, they move into institutional formats that have a lot of contestation. I mean, think of Cohen and also Eikenberry and a number of others moving into, you know, democratic leagues or democratic alliances. And if you look at their work, it's very much driven by this concern about the lack of discipline within, say, the United Nations. There's a need to overhaul, but it's not overhaul to bring global South countries in. In fact, it's a design to try to restrict global South countries by saying, well, unless you're democratic, you really shouldn't have a say within the UN. You know, there should be a special council that would. This didn't last very long because it got a pushback from, of course, many global South practitioners. But it shows again that somehow what you think the rational institutionalists are writing about and what they actually are writing about are completely different things. I mean, maybe it's Emil, but I think all through there's yes, there's a sense of frustration on my part about that some of these other kind of informal institutionalists welling up beyond the West really didn't get terribly far. I mean, one of my frustrations, of course, and Emil knows this very well, is that the MICTA initiative didn't really arise terribly far. I gave a kind of a major address to the Mexican ambassadors and consul generals in 2014, kind of expecting that they would be all sorts of enthusiasts about kind of rivaling the BRICS or moving into a different sense of, you know, concertation, and yet no real buy-in. And I think this is coming back to the question of strategic and tactical informality. I think there's going to be a lot of countries, not only within the UN, that work that sort of informal angle, and global South countries can do this as well as the North, but also you know, a variety of kind of, you know, they're not going to be global initiatives, but they're certainly at the regional level. And I think this is really going to be an exciting area for research, for younger scholars, particularly to kind of trace this event. And I think, Jeremy, I mean, I could talk a lot about the intersection between practice theory and my work. But one of the ideas, and I think it did radiate out, but I certainly could bring it out even further, is the notion of competence. you know, versus maybe improvisation. I mean, Jeremy's done work in some ways on both, but, you know, there's an improvisation within the global South, and you see it with BRICS, constant improvisation that really doesn't get much attention from the established IR scholars. That the fact that there's problems with Putin traveling to other countries, so okay, we'll allow Russia to host the BRICS this year, to kind of go around some of these impediments. But at the same time, the degree of emphasis that all of these global South countries, certainly within the G7 or the G20 and within the BRICS, to competent behavior. And you see this with Indonesia hosting the G20, huge amount of, I don't think anybody would have believed that Indonesia would have that ability to pull a very difficult summit off. We see it with India, very different. I mean, there's obviously things that you have problems with, but certainly in terms of being able to host, having an agenda and so on, very, very impressive, even with a lot of surprises at the G20 and beyond. So there's all these sort of factors that are playing. I mean, the question, Jeff had the question about South Africa. The question, of course, for every country now hosting is going to be the question of what sort of competent behavior those countries have. So there's going to be a lot of things that we can look at, I think. And again, just to reaffirm that rather than sort of closing the agenda down for the students of diplomacy. And again, in some ways, that was the risk that I kind of took in this book, because as soon as you start talking about concertation, it does, with some degree of validity, have this image of statecraft, right? Traditional statecraft. And even though there's a lot to it in terms of concertation, the richness of diplomacy is still there. And again, I think Jeremy brings this point out, that there's a lot of work that I think can still be done, probing and kind of being, through analytical lens that again has a richness that was probably I didn't do in this book, but it certainly alluded to that fact. So again, thanks for all the comments. It's wonderful to get this sort of feedback, and we'll have some Q&As as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And really good to hear that a book can be both a big synthesis, like your discussants are saying, and also to bring up lots of new questions for new generations of scholarship to tackle. You got some more applause and appreciative comments in the chat. There is still a number of colleagues also attending, so if you would like to ask a question, you can please do that. Otherwise, I would also like to ask maybe a final question, because I was so intrigued also what Jeremy was saying about the title of the book and this idea of why you picked this idea of impulse. So maybe, rounding off your presentation, we can go back to the beginning and to the title, and you can tell us the backstory to that one and the meaning of that term.
It's interesting, the questions that the publishers have for you. I think they liked the idea of impulse because it was sort of different. And obviously I'm not the same sophisticated, theorist of practices that, Jeremy and Vincent and Emmanuel Adler and others
Christine.
are. So in that sense, it sort of got me off the hook. I think I didn't want to put, even though Jeremy had pushed me to have, the practice, I didn't feel that I had the kind of authenticity. I wanted to make practice theory much more kind of implicit rather than explicit. But at the same time, what they did want to have, and this is why the title is extended into world politics. I think they were kind of a little worried that somehow this was going to look as kind of a domestic, kind of policy book, and even though there's lots of virtues in that, I think they wanted to accent the global sweep of this book, which I think is really, and I hadn't really, kind of thought about it too much. But I think with the move towards the BRICS Plus, towards kind of other countries within the global South. And maybe this is one of the themes that's got overlooked, you know, and I bring it out in the cartoon with the Chinese and the Global Times, is how informality was stigmatized by the global South, right? I mean, that was, and back to Jeff's point as well, I mean, the whole idea of the UN for the global South, this wasn't the perfect solution. They knew there was all sorts of arbitrariness. They knew they were at a huge amount of disadvantage in the Security Council. They knew that they'd come in late, like India, that they, you know, they weren't going to get fairness within the system. But when you look at the institutional choices of the past, you know, every time concertation appeared, it was usually at the disadvantage of the global South. Even, and I really hadn't paid much attention to this, even with these 1943, 1945 meetings, you know, of the big three, Stalin and the Soviet Union were at great pains to make sure that China was not included in those meetings, right? So there was always a huge exclusionary bias, you know, in terms of that again has to be brought out, that part of the story or part of the narrative that, again, the rationalists are not either interested in or aware of, that there's been a transformation, at least of the countries at the time, to use the language of, you know, some of the theorists, the practice theorists, that there has been a kind of a transformation of what they see as kind of competent behavior now. I mean, the competent behavior is to belong and to exercise some degree of authority in these informal institutions like BRICS. And this gives you a lot of leverage in the world to have that sort of capacity, and that other countries don't have that sort of ability or that sort of calling card, that they're invited, that there's a great deal of recognition that they should belong to those concerts.
If I can just add a word on that, so on what I like in the title, even if it's complex, I have to say, when you read it, you're like, oh, what's that? So that's puzzling. You want to look into that. But two things are interesting in the title: the impulse and the concertation. Yeah. Impulse, I think, also is a way for the title to make a connection with the criticism of rational choice, because an impulse is not rational. Yeah. So this is how the title make a reference. Obviously, it's not obvious when you read the title, but it's clear when you read the book. It's going after rational choice because it's an impulse. It's something that, so obviously practice theorists would use, well, they could even use impulse, but they would use other words. Improvisation may be one of them, but
yeah. But also, to use a practice theory, it's also a habit, right? I mean, when
exactly. That's right.
Okay, we did, you know, coming back to the Canadian component, you know, and certainly long conversations with Paul Martin and others, you know, okay, we did this in 1997, 98, 99. Okay, you know, this is on tap for 2007, 2006, 2008. And you even get leaders who have no sort of understanding of concertation or even the array of countries that is fascinating, right? George W. Bush in 2008. Okay, what do we do? You know, okay, we don't want to go to the UN, and this has to be brought out. I mean, and I do think I fill a gap. There's other people that have filled this gap as well, but I think I've done more kind of research about this really acrimonious relationship between the UN and the G20 in 2008 that is very, you know, and the poorer global South countries kind of animating the UN and just coming up against roadblocks one after the other, obstacles in trying to have that. But again, going back to Jeremy, it's the point I've left out, you know, and it's also one of my frustrations is the Canadian context. I mean, when you see the sort of leadership that was available at a certain time, driven by personalities, yes, but then, you know, the lack of leadership and sort of just going along with what seems to be the accepted kind of orthodoxy. And I think Jeremy brought out that point extremely well. But it comes back to that agency is important, that individuals are important, and sometimes they come from, you know, places that you imagine they'll come from. I mean, the arbitrariness, I mean, that's why I like the word that Bull uses. I mean, because you look back at the G20 on finance. I mean, yes, it advanced global governance, but to have Larry Summers and Paul Martin sitting down in the Willard Hotel and go through a list of countries saying that finance minister's in, you know, with his country or her country, that finance minister's not in. I mean, it's probably not what we treat our students to think about when we visualize global governance, right? I mean, and it's certainly different from the cadre of people that say, well, we should have 194 countries sitting around and have kind of transparent, open global governance. This is completely at odds with that sort of image, for better and worse. In some ways, it's terrible in normative conditions, but in terms of getting something operationalized, it's particularly when you have technical kind of entrepreneurs, institutional entrepreneurs in other countries like Mexico and so on, it does work quite efficiently. You can get things up and running very, very quickly. And of course, in 2008, that is the other story, how quickly that type of operation is. And again, going back to Cohen and the analysis of the 1930s. I mean, Cohen is extremely interested and a bit blasé about the lack of concertation in the 1930s. You know, that FDR doesn't want to invite or to be involved with any of the initiatives during the Great Depression. But then there's this huge gap. Okay, if they're not interested then, why are they interested in 2008? Why were they interested in 1997, 98, 99? And they don't go into this at all. And the rational design scholars don't go into this at all. There's no real kind of, again, curiosity. And it's not just reading. I mean, you don't have to read every language in the world to know what's going on in the world. And this is being pointed out again by Amitav and others, you know, that if you look through the indexes, a lot of the work, you know, it really is very paltry. I mean, you read, I mean, again, to belabor Cohen, but I will, you look at his major work on multilateralism, you know, a very good article, you know, if you kind of read it without really thinking too much. But if you look at the citations in it, there's one non-American citation in the whole article. And the one non-American citation is E.H. Carr. You know, so I mean, this doesn't really bode well for a kind of a curiosity-driven agenda, or an agenda that has some sort of international or global reach attached to it. It's a very, very narrow kind of armchair perspective on politics. And you can do well in armchair thinking, but you do have to be a little bit more outward looking and sophisticated in terms of that work. And again, maybe I have overdone, but Cohen has populated international IR. So it's not as though this legacy is gone and forgotten. I mean, in some ways, there's a lot of people who didn't get jobs in the United States, particularly, who were doing other work, right? Who were using other theories, where the people that were doing work along those lines did get jobs. So again, there's been huge costs, I think, in career terms by kind of picking the wrong school with the right school, you know, in terms of this work. So again, I think this has to be sort of a more ongoing form of contestation than just saying, oh, well, this is kind of old stuff, you know, it's long gone, it's old work. And again, it's just also even the interpretation of Trump. And I agree with Jeremy. I think it was probably, if I was more sophisticated in terms of practice theory, maybe I'll need a co-author. You know, you could go through this type of work and really do a good job, because there's a huge amount of kind of over expectation of Trump, right? I mean, there's a lot of literature, not in the rational design kind of ambit, but just in the kind of policy world in the United States, in the think tank world, that just see Trump as a normal politician. a normal kind of great power politician. And this is, right at Council on Foreign Relations, but it's even at times, even somebody like Dresner, right? That Trump is going to be your classic realist. He's not going to be any different than a lot of politicians, presidents we've seen before. And indeed, there's quite a few articles of Trump, going back to the 19th century, to being a concert-oriented politician sitting around like it's 1812, 1814. I mean, Trump is interested in concerts. He certainly is interested in the G20 because he can sit around with Xi and Erdogan and Putin and so on. It's less that he wants to sit around and be with Macron or Trudeau or Merkel or others. So again, there's this sort of fascinating, even in the present day, how there's kind of a misreading. And then if you extrapolate into the rational IR, there's a completely lack of anticipation. And here, I think you have to get into the liberal internationalist. Eikenberry, he's a little bit more aware of what's happening, but not to the expense that he sees his theory being eroded or dilapidated in sense. And then there's the old, and I haven't really mentioned them, the kind of old kind of neo-realist types that again saw the global South as a disruptive force. If you read somebody like Stephen Krasner's books in the 80s, I mean, they really are quite problematic reading them. I mean, there's kind of a real, it's not just US-centric. I mean, there's kind of a xenophobic kind of component to this, that somehow the global South is on the march, that it's going to take over the UN. It's all about power grab. The US is being backed into the corner, principled actor, committed multilateralist that now finds that the UN is being taken out of its hands and so on. I mean, there's a lot of room, by historians or by kind of political IR / historians that could go back and I think do very good forensic work on this literature of the 80s and 90s.
Great. Thank you so much, both to Andrew and to our three discussants for this.
I just wanted to finish the initial idea. There are two things I like in the title. Sorry, Christine, I interrupt you. But that's something also I think that is important to note. So the impulse is a great idea. And I think concertation is also a great idea. Because we know concert. But concertation is, I think, you could have made, I mean, I hope you do a big splash with concertation with the book, but there is certainly room for articles around concertation as a concept. And this is a good concept because the criticism of, oh, you're talking about the concert of Europe is quickly dismissed with that move away from concert to concertation. So there are a lot of good things you said in your answer and in the book also, but impulse and concertation, two great ideas, I think.
Thanks.
Sorry, Christine.
And if I can just have a final word on this. I mean, you see sort of the ambivalence of some, critical scholars. Robert Cox is a very good example, right? That does use, I think because he is influenced by European thinking and European public policy making. He understands how concertation, the domestic level, is so embedded in many countries, particularly in Western Europe. But at the same time, there's the ambivalence about whether this sort of concertation model can be imported with authenticity into forums like the G20. Is the G20 just going to be the global North in command with a kind of a little rump of global South countries that go along, or the disciplined or socialization? And I think in some ways there was a misreading, right, of the lack of power or the degree that those countries were socialized into, kind of the Northern thinking or the Northern operation along concertation. So this is why you sort of even ask the countries like China, India, Indonesia, and so on, Brazil coming into the G20, and I should say without protest, right? There's no sort of bargaining in those countries in 2008. There's no country that says, I'll only come if you do this or that, which in previous eras, there certainly would have been. But at the same time, they didn't want to come into the G20 without some sort of space for their own autonomous action. So again, I think this is what's so fascinating, and there's other work I think that can be done on concertation, because just as you become kind of an insider in one form of concertation, you want to be an outsider in another form of concertation. And this puts pressure, it puts pressure on Turkey, and puts pressure on other countries that don't have those choices in the international system. So there's a lot of things here, but I agree. I think I'm really enthralled now by the idea of not just doing more about the idea of concertation, but maybe getting a little bit more conversant in the impulse sort of resonance of the title itself.
And Jeff, you also had your hand up. No. You're muted.
It was meant to be an applause, Kristen.
Okay, it was meant to be an applause. Excellent. Great, thank you so much. And I think we've reached the end of the time we've been given together here today. I have three main takeaways, I think, from this. The first is we should all read this book. And the second is there's more research to be done and more books and papers to be written. And the third is that we can hopefully all try to meet up or see each other either at the actual ISA in 2 weeks, or at the next event that we will have in this format. But I want to thank both Andrew, of course, for presenting his excellent work, and our panelists and our attendees, and the ISA for having this very nice event. And yeah, I hope we can all see each other again soon.
Wonderful, and see most of you at ISA. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Christine, for sharing. Thanks.
Yeah, yes.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone.
Ciao, ciao.
Great to see you.
Goodbye.
See you.
See you in a
Good
few
to
weeks.
see you.